working at the EDU-ARCTIC project. I participated in 2 polar expeditions to the Antarctic and the Arctic, and in EDU-ARCTIC project I'm sharing my experience of living and working in polar regions. And today we will discuss about the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, but about the main part connected with the Ernest Shackleton, not with the second part of the expedition that started from the Ross Sea. But yeah, we'll discuss it later on. And the first question for you is, who reached the South Pole as the first person in the world? So it is the question. Of course, if you would like to, you can use the chat using Cisco WebEx meeting, or you can use the Slido application to give your replies. So there is a question about the South Pole. Who reached as the first person the South Pole and when it was? Of course, if you remember. We will start from the very beginning. I hope that all of you can hear me and see me, that there are any technical problems. Don't hesitate to use Slido, don't hesitate to use chat. And yes, the first question was about the reaching the South Pole, when it was and who did it. Okay, so we have the map of the Antarctica, the continent, and you can see everything on that area. But it was the very beginning of the 20th century, and people really didn't have a huge knowledge as we have nowadays about that continent, and many places were unknown. So that's why Ernest Shackleton and the rest of the explorers from the heroic age of Antarctic exploration decided to reach that unknown areas. And here we have short information about the Ernest Shackleton, because we will not focus on the biography of the Ernest Shackleton. Of course, he is a very interesting person, and it is worth to read some information about himself. But he was the participant of the Robert Falcon Scott expedition on Discovery vessel. That was the expedition, the southernmost, who reached the Antarctic region. We all know. There is a map. Of course, we will be focusing on some old maps concerning that topic, and I would like to emphasize that those materials, that presentation was prepared by Jerzy Giżejewski. Jerzy is also a specialist working at EDU-ARCTIC project, and he gave that lesson in Polish about the Ernest Shackleton and the Transantarctic expedition, and now I'm basing on his materials. Will tell you a little bit about that story, but in English. So yes, so the materials were prepared by Jurek. Okay, I don't see any answers for my question. I would like to tell you that the question is still on the board. So who reached the South Pole? The question is, use Slido please, or use the chat on Cisco WebEx meeting. And the second expedition that Ernest Shackleton participate was to the South Pole, but it was unsuccessful, and they reached the Weddel Sea, and on that area there was a huge pack ice, so it was impossible to go farther south. But that was the possibility to explore the area of the Weddel Sea, because Shackleton had in his mind an idea to make a transcontinental march from the Weddel Sea to the Ross Sea. interesting information that last year that road was made by the first Polish woman, Małgorzata Wojtaczka. Of course, he was not the first woman that reached the South Pole, but in Poland she was the first, and she did that road. That's interesting, and so that was rather a recognition of the new area, especially that in 1911 there was a German expedition under the Wilhelm Filchner, and he was able only to reach the Weddel Sea, but he was close to the Weddel Bay, and the Filchner said that it is possible to make a depot, the deposition of the cargo in the Weddel Bay, and it's interesting place where Shackleton, for example, could start his road to the Ross Sea. And here we have the map. There are some roads marked on that map where were organized some expeditions to the Antarctic region. And here in the black line we have the Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance expedition, and the expedition to the Ross Sea was the second one, because of course that the transcontinental march was very difficult to organize without any help. So Shackleton decided to organize that expedition in two parts. The third part was under his command on the ship Endurance, and they wanted to start from the Weddel Bay, from the north, and the second one on the ship Aurora under the Aeneas Mackintosh started from the Ross Sea in the south, and the aim of that part of the expedition was to prepare a depot, the deposition of cargo and food supply in a route towards the Broadmoor Glacier. And the aim was that the people from the first and the second part of the expedition met in that place on that glacier. So without satellite connection and so on, they organized and decided somehow that they manage it. But of course, it was unfortunately impossible, and we will see why. There is a map from that time. There is an explored region marked on the north part of the continent, and that was the aim of the Shackleton, because he knew that after reaching the South Pole by Roald Amundsen, the only main goal he might achieve is the transcontinental march. So it was, of course, connected with some scientific measurements and so on, but that was the exploring of the unknown area, first of all. And, of course, there was information in the newspaper that he is looking for the people that will participate in the expedition. And I know that maybe all of you know very well that text that men are wanted for hazardous journeys, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. But to be honest, it's hard to say if that advertisement was true. It's rather apocryphal. I didn't find any information, any source that it really was like this. Maybe it is connected with the legend of the Ernest Shackleton, maybe not. But it's very famous now, very well known. And the result was that about 5,000 resumes, let's say, applications, was received by Ernest Shackleton, and even a few girls decided to send the applications, but they wrote that they may be a good company for men not a real members of the expedition. And of course, that was impossible for women to take part in that kind of expeditions. Nowadays, it's normal that the women are the members of the wintering staffs in polar stations around the world, around the polar regions. In the result, 28 people were chosen for the expedition. Very important thing was to, for example, at first obtain the ship, and that was the Polaris. That was the ship built for Adrien de Gerlache. Adrien de Gerlache was the leader of the Belgian Antarctic Expedition. I had a lesson about that on that topic. And he decided to go to the Spitsbergen, but it was not organized, the expedition. So that's why the Shackleton decided to obtain the ship from the Gerlache, and he renamed it to Endurance because that was his motto, the Endurance. And the second ship, Aurora, for Eneas McIntosh, was obtained in Australia. So having two ships, he needs to more funds to organize that whole expedition, and of course he applied for donation from the government, from the private investors, and from many sources. And as a result, for example, he even sold the rights for all films, photos that will be recorded during the expedition. But that was no other different option. We know that there were two ships, and the plan was that from the Weddel Sea, in Vexel Bay, made a first depot, and there stayed 14 people, and only 6 with Ernest Shackleton will go through South Pole to the Ross Sea. That is a distance approximately of 2,900 kilometers. Dogs as well were used during the expedition, and Shackleton decided to use dogs during his transcontinent march to the South Pole and the Ross Sea. There were approximately 70 dogs in the expedition, but unfortunately, when they finally in 1940 start the expedition, and they have a short stop in Buenos Aires, and after that go to the South Georgia. The expedition started in that place and go south to the Weddel Sea. But unfortunately, the ship was stuck in a pack ice, and it was very unpredictable because Shackleton thought that would be any problems with the pack ice, but unfortunately it took part. So in October they decided to overwintered in that special conditions because they know that there is rather very difficult to leave the ship. But somehow they decided to find the solution. And of course, they had everything on board. They were very well prepared for the expedition. So when the Endurance was stuck in a pack ice, Shackleton decided to march in the southern direction to find the way to the South Pole because he thought that will be still possible, maybe somehow. And in November, they take all the stuff from the ship and go on the pack ice and made a camp that was called Ocean Camp because that was on the pack ice. And they spent there a few times. And that was in a very close area to the ship, so that's why they could have took some stuff in slowly and efficiently from the ship to the camp. But in the end of the November, the Endurance sank and disappeared. So they were without ship, and they know that they somehow can look for the rescue. So of course the Shackleton was the guy that was responsible for the people, for the expedition, and he thought that he know that his role is very huge, and somehow he needs to organize the life and free time of their men. Anyway, the Shackleton decided to march in another place. That was the camp called Patience, and it was still on a pack ice because they know that they didn't reach the Weddel Bay, the aim of that the place where they can leave the depot. And in that place, they stayed in the patient camp for 3 months. That was a very long period. And the role of the Shackleton was very difficult because people had some problems with health, with mental diseases, and he needed to organize the time for them. So they did some fitness, sport activities. The Shackleton took care of the morale of the group. So that was very important in that situation. Okay, thanks for your question. We can find fossil under ice? I think so, but it's rather on the continent. And now when the Antarctic Treaty, the main document, is still valid, and many states around the world signed that document, any exploration isn't possible. So yeah, so now that the political and economical situation on the Antarctica looked like this. And here we have the map of the Ernest Shackleton Road. We know that he left Great Viken, and when they crossed the Antarctic Circle, they stuck on Weddel Sea in a pack ice, close to the Weddel Bay, but they didn't reach it. Here we have the Endurance that was trapped in a pack ice. During that time when they were trapped in a pack ice, they still have dogs. Of course, the people made a strong relationship with that animals, but in the end, when the food was scarce and the food supplies were not enough for the men, Shackleton decided to shoot off all the animals the men had. There were even a cat on board, Mrs. Chimpy, that belonged to the carpenter, that was a member of the expedition, but that was the decision of the Shackleton because the people there was a threat that people would starve, so that's why they don't need the dogs anymore. Okay, so in April 2019 and 15. Yes, in April, the situation was so serious because that was Antarctic spring, and everything started to melt. So the patients camp was organized on a pack ice, and it was very dangerous to people that they would all die because of the surface that wasn't stable anymore. So the Shackleton decided to use boats. They have 3 boats for the people. That was 28 people in that team that started from the South Georgia, and he decided to went somewhere for the rescue. But that was not an easy option because the islands that were located nearby were in a very long distance. So finally they decided to choose the nearest point. That was the Elephant Island, and that was 1,300 kilometers from the point they were trapped in a pack ice. And using that 3 boats, they finally reached the Elephant Islands, but that was an inhabited place, and Shackleton knows that when they stayed on that island, they would all die because nobody would help them, especially that the conditions on the sea were very severe. So that's why he decided to take 6 strong men, rebuild the boat, and to try to reach the South Georgia. And he took the food supply only for 4 weeks because he knew that if they in that period didn't reach any land, the boat will be lost. So it's senseless to take more food supply. So that was a very, very complicated road because during the 14 days they were struggled with the storm, trying to reach the South Georgia, but finally they did it. And here you have on a photo that the meal that on a ship when the Endurance was still stuck in the pack ice, because they at first overwintered in the ship, and after that, when it started sinking, they moved to the camps and tents where the whole life was organized somehow. And of course, as I told you, the Shackleton was responsible for the morale of his group, and he did it very, very well. And here is the photo of with the dogs. And it's interesting and important that there were also some people responsible for the PR, let's say, of the expedition, and that was artist who painted during the expedition some paintings concerning the expedition, and there was a photographer, and that's why we have nowadays the beautiful photo from that expedition. And again, the route of Ernest Shackleton, we know that when they stuck in a pack ice, the ship was drifted, and finally it sank. Here is the Elephant Island. It is close to the northernmost top of Antarctic Peninsula, and here in April 1915, Ernest Shackleton left his people and went for the rescue to South Georgia with only five people on board. And when they reached the Elephant Island, the situation was so strong because not everybody was able to go to the whaling village, whaling base on South Georgia. So Shackleton only with 2 men go through the interior, through the mountains to reach the camp and to ask for the rescue. That was impossible that time because nobody knew what is really in that island. It was unexplored. Only from the sea that was the access to the camp. So the whalers were very surprised and shocked why those people visited them when there were no any ships on a sea. So even they were in such a serious mental condition that Shackleton wrote after the expedition that he had an impression during that march that they were not in a 3 people but in a 4 people, that there is somebody else, but he didn't know who it was. To be honest, that situation is very typical for example, climbers in Himalaya mountains when they are exhausted and they are not feel very well and are not full responsible for themselves, so they can see people or objects that don't exist. Okay, so in that South Georgia, Shackleton asked for help. So the three men from the Elephant Island was picked up by a ship, but I'm sorry, not from the Elephant Island, but from the South Georgia, because he left three people on the shore and looked for help from the camp, whaling camp, and to pick people from Elephant Island was not so easy, because it was the summer of 1915, and there were no ships to organize to go to the Elephant Island. So he looked for help in Southern America, and finally on a ship Yelhoff of Chilean one, he sailed to Elephant Island and picked up his men. It was in August 1915. So that was a very successful story, because everybody was saved and nobody were hurt. And interesting thing is that on Elephant Island were taking over an operation, because one of the guy had a very serious frostbite on his left toe, and it needed to be amputated. And the doctors, there were two doctors at the expedition, they managed to use the very last amount of the chloroform and did the operation, and after that the patient was nice, very fine, and everything was okay. And the history of the second part of the expedition, that on a ship Aurora, was less successful, because they of course reached almost the Ross Sea. Of course, there was a huge pack ice on it, and there was a big gale on that sea. So the ship started drifting and couldn't find the position. But finally, they were able to reach the McMurdo Sound, and after that leave the depot in the road towards the South Pole. But unfortunately, three people died during that expedition. So when the Ernest Shackleton rescued his people, after that there was another rescue expedition from Australia for the second ship, for the Aurora. So we can say that the expedition was not successful if we are thinking about the aim, because the aim was to go through the Antarctic continent. But that was a very very beautiful example of the human's endurance, brave, and how the leader was responsible for his men in a very serious condition. To be honest, when Shackleton get back home, that was the time of the First World War, so nobody even noticed that Shackleton came back home, and only after a few years some people spotted that it was a very big success. So that was not so easy. And here in the end we have the map of the Antarctic continent, and there is a road of endurance expedition and the Aurora expedition. So finally almost all members of the expedition were saved, despite of that three people that died on Aurora ship, trying to organize the path for Shackleton's people from the Weddel Sea. Okay, so here we have the end of the presentation.